welcome from Ukraine. I'm very pleased and I'm very happy to welcoming all our distinguished friends and colleagues from the different countries. And I'm really honored to be a part of this Zero Corruption conference, because I remember 2 years ago we're sitting together with the Daria at Washington, D.C., somewhere in a cafe. And I was telling her that I wish to come one day into the Kiev in a conference which is not organized by oligarchs, you know? And thank you so much, Daria Kaliniuk and Hanna Hopko, that you make my dreams true, because I'm really happy, and one day I'm going to be very happy again to come in Zero Corruption, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova as well. I'm Nino Evgenidze, an Executive Director of Economic Policy Research Center from Georgia. I'm a founder of the Tbilisi International Conference together with the McCain Institute, and I'm a founder of the Fukuyama Democracy Frontline Center in Georgia. As we know all that the Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are facing a number of existential challenges, which are often coming from the same root causes, and those are the internal vulnerabilities and external threats. When we're talking about the internal vulnerabilities, of course, where it comes to the issues of the kleptocracy, corruption, weak institutions, and within external threat, of course, I mean the Russia, which encourages the export of the autocratic ways of governance in the neighboring country, and not only in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, but some other countries as well. And with the separatist proxies or the oligarchs, they're trying to undermine the democracies of these countries. With this distinguished panel, and I'm very happy to present our really great friends of these three countries, Mr. Andrius Kubilius, the president of the Euronest and the former prime minister of the Lithuania, Michael Carpenter, great friend of Georgia and Ukraine, and we know how his heart beats for us, and Nicu Popescu, he is a former minister of foreign affairs, and now he is within the Council of Foreign Relations. And last not but least, the Miss Katarina Mathernova from the European Commission, and Miss Oksana Euronest, former member of the Parliament of Ukraine, and now she works together with the Daria Kaliniuk and Hanna Hopko on different issues going in Ukraine. Thank you so much for this a great panel, and I'm very privileged to be a moderator to this panel. And we have some slight changes in our the agenda, and maybe later the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dimitro Kuleba, is going to join this discussion as well. We all know that we're facing the different challenges right now, but I would like to ask to Andrius Kubilius that what are the main obstacles which is for main obstacles for democratic transformation for Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. Andrius, maybe we will start from you, and then with the follow-up questions go to the other speakers as well.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, and good afternoon to everybody. Best regards from Strasbourg. We, European Parliament, have the first session now again in Strasbourg after quite a long period of time. And
I cannot hear.
I will try to answer your question in a very brief way. A democratic transformation in Eastern Partnership countries really is one of the very big and important challenges, not only for the countries themselves, especially not only for so-called trio of associated countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, but this is a challenge also for the whole European Union and all European continent. since really spread of democratic values is one of major directions how stability, security and peace on European continent can be established for a long period of time. Of course, all of us, countries of Central and Eastern Europe, we were facing very similar challenges from the very beginning after our transformation to democracy. For us, it was maybe easier. We had a very clear policy from EU side from the very beginning in 1990s. EU offered us membership perspective, and that was keeping us on track. At the same time, back in 90s, Russia was under Yeltsin leadership, was more or less, a democratic country, which was not so very much against of us becoming members of EU and later on, and at the same time, members of NATO. So for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, of course, the challenges are bigger ones, since they were a little bit more slow at the very beginning. Now, membership perspective in EU is still not very clearly offered by from EU side. Russia is also different, and that makes all the situation much more challenging. But I would say that really both Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, all three countries, despite all the problems, despite the corruption, oligarchs, Kremlin influences, even the war in eastern part of Ukraine, those countries are doing good progress. And that is why I believe that they will manage to really to establish themselves as mature democracies. And from that point of view, they are also playing very important role. They are showing example to other societies, for example, for Belarusian society and even for Russian society, how really move towards democratic development of their countries. So things are in this part of Europe really is are very, very, very challenging, sometimes very tragic, but nevertheless, history, I think history is on the side of those who are going for democracy, like three associated countries or Belarusian society, or those who are fighting for democracy also in Russia. So from historical point of view, I am optimistic that we shall see how democracy will spread into all that territory.
Andrius, if I may, just like follow-up questions. In your opinion, what is Russia is trying to achieve in these three different countries? Like, what his main goal on this, in this battle against freedom and democracy?
Well, at least in my understanding, President Putin is very much afraid of exactly of integration of Eastern Partnership countries towards EU, because this is the only way how success of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova can be created. And success of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova is really an inspiration for Belarusian or Russian people. And that is what President Putin understands as the biggest danger for such a regime like he has in Kremlin, for autocratic regime. So that's why what I see as his strategy or tactics is not so much, to grab new territories, despite the fact that he occupied Crimea and still, part of Eastern Partnership of eastern part of Ukraine. But nevertheless, as a major goal, I see all his attempts to prevent integration of Ukraine, to prevent integration of Georgia and Moldova into EU, because if that integration will go with more ambitious, targets from both sides, from Ukraine, from Georgia and Moldova, and also from EU side, that can create really much stronger, development of success of those countries. And that is what in Kremlin they understand as a danger, for their regime, because that success can inspire Russian people to seek very similar development.
Thank you so much. And just to turn from Andrius, and still we are staying in a European context, that all these three countries are like they have their individual context. But what do you think, Katarina, from your standpoint, that what is common that these three countries have to do together in terms of to get their like a main goal to be a part one day the European family?
Well, first, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. First, thank you very much for inviting me, and indeed, it's fantastic to be able to be here and to be at the conference that Hanna and Daria organized. So I share your sentiment very much, and it is in fact surrounded on the topic or focused on the topic that I have spent a big part of my career professionally devoted to. How do you help countries overcome corruption? How do you instill accountable behavior? And so I will get to that, but first to your question. Look, we have entered into we as the EU, into very deep and far-reaching. I don't know which camera I should look at. I know that there was a guy ferociously waving at you, so guys, tell me, where do I look at? There? Oh, okay, good. So there is a guy waving at me. Good. Now I know where to look. We have entered into the association agreements and the deep and comprehensive free trade areas with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, with the two a little bit before Ukraine. And the geopolitical context at that time was very, very different. And all the three countries were really entering with the idea that there perhaps is a membership perspective behind at some point. And unfortunately, and these days, with all the different tectonic shifts in geopolitics, that doesn't seem to be an immediate option. And that's why what I think needs to happen among the three countries, and also doing it together, but also individually vis-à-vis the EU and the entire sort of transatlantic architecture, is to continue on the reform path. Because once there is a window of opportunity to move further, the window of opportunity may be very small. And one needs to continue the reforms, because ultimately the reforms are not for the benefit of the EU or the US or NATO or anybody else. They are for the benefit of citizens. They are for the benefit of businesses and people in the countries to live in an accountable, just society, prosperous and stable. So I think that what is really important for the three countries is to develop much more of a camaraderie, because the interests are very much joined than we sometimes see. We certainly look at Ukraine as the one that perhaps could be more of a regional leader, and certainly of the associate members than has been necessarily the intentions so far. And I think that it's very much in the EU's interest to invest, to display strategic patience, but to invest in the reforms, in the reform dialogue, in the support to the authorities, but also supporting, and this is something that we have really scaled up very, very significantly, supporting the civil society, supporting independent media, and supporting the reform actors that I think this is the strength of this part of the world. Certainly in Kiev, it's a fantastic place. We just talked about Hanna and Daria. I mean, it's amazing that you actually have the capacity in the civil society to put on a conference like this and have the convening power that one has. And I think that's really in the interest of all of us to develop these elements and develop the strength, because just putting support in one direction is not going to work. But at the same time, we also need to help the states, whether it's Ukrainian state, whether it's Georgian state, whether it's Moldovan state, to become stronger. and be able to carry out the public service functions and the provision of justice, provision of security, etc., in a non-corrupt and competent way. So I think it's really something that's in the interest both of the EU and of the three countries to work on, and ultimately the final beneficiary of all the efforts are the citizens of the three countries.
Thank you so much, Katarina, for your comments and for your reflection on this regard. And you mentioned the geopolitics, and the geopolitics in wider Black Sea region is changing, especially after the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And the status quo now is totally different, because we have more like a presence of the Russian troops in this region, unfortunately. And what are the compelling like a US and European interest in the region, and what are the tools Washington and Brussels have at hand to maintain or to contain the Russians there?
I will leave Michael to comment on the US tools, if you allow
sure,
me.
Yeah.
I mean, look, yes, we now have a situation that we have Russia much more present than we had before the conflict. And the scenario was very similar to what happened some years ago in Transnistria. And I think that it's not entirely clear that both sides of the conflict realize the impact it's going to have in 5 years and 6 years and 7 years. I mean, I noted very well the comments of a Georgian deputy minister who said, well, wait 5 years and see how it's going to be easy to get get the Russians out. Look at Ossetia, look at Abkhazia. So yes, we have much more of their presence, and what is in our interest is to again keep stability, develop and invest in prosperity, and invest in the reform elements in the country. That's one of the reasons why we are rolling out as part of Eastern Partnership a big economic investment program for all the countries to really bring and maintain also the economic dynamism, and at the same time engage with the governments on the reform path, and invest in the free media and fighting disinformation, hybrid warfare, and support for the civil society.
Thank you so much, Katarina. And just to turn to Mike, just to continue on the same question, what do you think? Is America truly back? And if so, what is next? And how the U.S. policy is going to be after this new reality for these Eastern European countries? And what is your suggestions on the recommendations and analysis on this regard?
Well, thank you, Nino, and it's great to be with you. I do think the United States is back. I think it's taken some time for us to get people into various chairs so that they can start making decisions and traveling to the region and engaging. Because ultimately, what we're talking about here as a tool is engagement. This is, as Andrius Kubilius has rightly put it, sort of the region where the two geopolitical tectonic plates of liberal democracy and authoritarian oligarchy are colliding. And they're colliding both in the sense that there are geopolitical eruptions caused by outside actors, such as with Russia's occupation of Georgia, Russia's troop presence in Transnistria, Russia's ongoing war in Donbass and occupation of Crimea, but it's also internal to these societies. And as you see, corrupt oligarchs grabbing onto power and consolidating both political and economic control. And that's why I call this region sort of the place where democracy rubs up against authoritarian oligarchy, because it really is both authoritarian in the sense that political space is being constricted, but it's also oligarchy in the sense that economic competition is being restricted. And so therefore, if that is what is going on, if that is the correct diagnosis, then the tools available to the United States are to engage in order to prevent oligarchization and engage in order to promote political competition, and to promote the sovereignty of these countries and their ability to defend their sovereignty against outside actors. And so it's a varied toolkit. It requires, on the one hand, some military elements, some sort of classic deterrence and defense elements to help the countries of the region to defend their territory, their sovereignty. But then it also requires very deep engagement with the governments and the civil societies and the business communities of the region, of these various countries that we're talking about, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, precisely to keep them from sliding into this oligarchic populism or authoritarian oligarchy. And there, it really requires the United States to be engaged at the day-to-day level. We cannot take our eye off the ball for longer than a few days or a few weeks before bad things start to happen. We have to promote things like corporate governance standards. We have to promote things like politically independent anti-corruption institutions. We have to talk to the governments on an almost daily basis when we see troubling aspects of their behavior that could lead to greater influence for oligarchs and for oligarchization. So really, this all boils down to, Nino, the need for the United States and the EU to work in tandem, but to remain engaged, to push the governments, to work with civil society actors, and to make sure that the reform process has momentum. Because when we turn our eyes away from the region, when we don't stay engaged, we see that there is almost inevitably each and every time some form of backsliding.
Thank you so much, Mike, for this always supportive position. But, we will just following the Georgia's backsliding for their democracy, unfortunately. And I'm from Georgia. I will talk about my own country, not our neighboring and the friend countries, but the situation almost the same in every country, all these three countries, yes? And that how the civil society alone can fight against this kind of a big oligarchs whose wealth is exceeding a Georgian budget or Ukrainian budget or Moldovan budget. It should be joint battle together with the European Union and the United States on this regard. And you will hear a lot of discussions about the sanctions, personal sanctions, ban, and so. Is it really works, or it just the formal tools just to make them worry about their assets and the corrupt the activities?
Well, I think sanctions can be a part of the toolkit, but clearly alone they're insufficient to achieve anything. And so by the same token that the US and the EU need to be working and engaged in the region, the US and the EU are not going to be the actors that lead to the democratization and the consolidation of democracy in these countries. It's only going to be the actors inside these countries themselves, the political elite and civil society, that are able to achieve those changes. But what we can do is we can shape the incentive structure. We can both apply negative sanctions, which in some cases may be necessary with particularly corrupt actors, but we can also provide positive incentives in terms of security assistance, in terms of reform assistance. And I think it's unfortunate that we've seen with some of the openings, say in Armenia after the Velvet Revolution, and other countries, that we have not engaged as we could have when countries were willing to make the changes themselves. That I think is crucial.
Thank you so much. We were talking about the the US and Europe joint engagement, more engagement in this three different countries, and we have a honor and the pleasure to read the letter of the U.S. Senator Mr. Christopher Coons, who just wrote this letter to the organizers of the Zero Corruption Conference that democratic and independent Ukraine with strong rule of law and respect for fundamental rights and freedom is an existential threat to Vladimir Putin's government and the many corrupt and authoritarian regimes that rely on its support. I'm proud to support Ukraine's sovereignty and democratic journey. My Senate colleagues and I have worked to facilitate foreign assistance that bolstered Ukrainian civil society, began needed police reforms, and supported efforts to weed out corruption in the judiciary and elsewhere. I think it's a very strong support from the US Senator, and we hope that the real, the measures is going to be coming soon. Just to turn to the Ukrainian context, I would like to ask Oksana Yurinets to tell us what is going here, really. I mean, from the civil society organizations to see real, pictures. Are Ukraine, Georgia, or Moldova are really trendsetters in this region for freedom fight and a democratic transformation? Or how looks it from your standpoint?
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking our colleagues, Mr. Kubilius, Mrs. Mathernova, Mr. Carpenter, who are always giving unwavering support to Ukraine. But this conference, this event organized by Hanna Hopko and Daria Kaleniuk, is a vivid example of the civil society pulling ranks and taking a stance on what's happening in the country. During the 8th convocation in Parliament, we tried to raise the Ukrainian agenda, knowing that Eastern Partnership isn't an alternative. We knew that we had to take the lead, and in the context of these three countries, there's no clear statement of Moldova about Euro-Atlantic integration. It's only Ukraine and Georgia. As for the 6 countries, there are some that have shown their inefficiency institution-wise. But today, protecting the national interest is a top priority, and we do it through liaising with universities, supporting the Erasmus program, Eastern Partnership programs by educating the young people. They shouldn't only know what European and Euro integration is about, but being aware that they need to be the diplomats to promote the efforts. There are a lot of civil activists here attending Democracy in Action conference, and to be open, the analytical note that we produce and share with our partners on the matters of corruption, reform in Ukraine. We see that for this mission to happen in Ukraine, it has to be a joint effort of the Parliament, President, civil society, and everyone involved. Only standing together we will prevent. Considering the soft annexation of Belarus, Ukraine finds itself in a vacuum. As a head of the parliamentary delegation to NATO, I can tell you that some drastic moves towards Euro-Atlantic integration have been met with the annexation of Crimea and the Ukrainian territories. When we make it openly and decisively, we are repelled with aggression. So to overcome these strengths, we need support. Apart from Eastern Partnership format, Ukraine should be promoting its agenda by joining ranks with the Baltic states and Polish with our near partners. who know how to act together. Far too often we face these challenges alone. And we don't just need to change to join NATO or the EU. We come closer to have a better chance, knowing that we can be leaders and we can offer support to Georgia and Moldova and other countries seeking reform. It's very important that this Democracy in Action conference is happening today. I will recall the words of the newly elected president, who said that that was democracy in action. But it's important that we don't give up and persevere. It's very important the reforms initiated to the dignity revolution are realized. And this conference, organized by the civil activists and international players, is a showcase that it's far more important to act in the national interest than to engage in electoral processes. We know that information space has become hybrid, and often the meaning is distorted or malign meaning is invested in words. But this event speaks for itself. It says that you cannot give up on your country, your neighbors, or the world. We have to act in the interest of our country and serve it with its knowledge and heart. After leaving our parliamentary service, we went on to share the information and knowledge with our partners so that they would be better vested in what's happening in Ukraine, and our strive for sustainable democracy will reap results. I can assure you that the experts who've joined us, like the New Europe Center, we often see some studies showing the way ahead, exposing our weaknesses, calling for remedies. Ukraine has to continue evolving. That's a major undertaking, and we wouldn't do it alone. But today, to address the issue with Belarus, we know that the issue of Armenia, Azerbaijan was solved without European partnership, and Armenia and others are a threat that will also affect Ukraine. So by bringing civil activists and EU experts, the US representatives around this conference, it's important to define the roadmap that is to be defined. And we have to do our part for ourselves. And I'm sure we will succeed if we stand united.
Thank you so much, Oksana. It's going to be a good example for our Belarusian friends, but I think we have to perform better to be a trendsetters and be an example for the other countries and other freedom fighters in Belarus, in Armenia, or some other Azerbaijan. That it's really they really mean to follow our path. And to turn to the democratic transformation, and this is very dynamic process. And I just want to ask to Nicu Popescu that what you think that what you and the West, how they can help to consolidation of the democracy in these three different countries, in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. You are sitting in Berlin, I guess, and how, not anymore? Okay, last time when I saw before pandemic, you were in Berlin. And how you see this, how you see this, the consolidation of democracy here?
Thank you, Nino. I am based in Paris, actually. But listen, I think that these countries are finding themselves in a very difficult situation still. We're too early to talk about Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia as showing an example when it comes to the anti-corruption agenda. They have definitely managed to semi-consolidate a functioning, semi-functioning democratic systems. But on the corruption front, things are quite bad. Especially for Georgia and Moldova. If you go to check the corruption perception index from the last year, you would see that Moldova and Ukraine are on the 115th
But
and the 100th.
Nicu, just to mention that you remember a few years ago that Georgia was the #1 performer country against the corruption. And this example shows again that it's not irreversible, you know. Whenever it comes to defend or to contain the Russian oligarchic and the kleptocratic expert, we have to do more to strengthening the institutions. Sorry for interrupting.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Nino, and that was to a degree my next point. And that point was to say that normally when you talk about corruption in Europe, in most of the European countries or in most consolidated democracies, you talk of corruption as an economic and political program. Corruption undermines economic growth, or it can undermine trust in the democratic system. And that is all true for Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, but corruption is also a major security problem. In the case of our countries, you know very well, and you know, in Ukraine in recent months, you have seen how there have been pretty straight attempts to close off some channels through which corruption was used as a conduit to destabilize the Ukrainian political system. But there are many more conduits, both in Ukraine, in Moldova, and in Georgia, whereby corruption is that channel which is used for security purposes. And for our countries, corruption is not just an economic or political problem, but it's also a major security problem. And that is why I think there are some important takeaways, especially for the international partners of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine that are trying to support the democratic consolidation of Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia. And here, I think one of the most important things is to note, and Katarina has spent much of the last 10 years trying to improve and contribute to strengthening of the political and economic performances of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. But as the European Union is talking these days and months about what next for the Eastern Partnership, I think it's very important to realize that the Eastern Partnership has played a good and positive role in economic transition when it comes to boosting free trade, when it comes to saving or creating jobs in the free associated countries. The Eastern Partnership has had a pretty good impact on the energy security of Moldova and Ukraine, primarily, less so on Georgia. But at the same time, we know that the Eastern Partnership has been very shy when it comes to dealing and helping countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia from strengthening their security sectors and institutions. And to me, it is absolutely clear that if you want to consolidate democracies, it's absolutely imperative to do it by strengthening civil society and the media, but you cannot achieve a fundamental democratic consolidation only by working to strengthen civil society and the media. You also need to strengthen the security sectors of these countries. There are no consolidated democracies which have corrupt, penetrated, dysfunctional security and defense system, police, army, intelligence services, especially in this part of the world when we talk about hybrid threats, which has been clearly, openly, a major concern for the European Union, for Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. We should also realize that the way to combat hybrid threats is, again, to try and limit disinformation. But when it comes to illegal party finance, of which we already know, we even know numbers of some of these cash flows that are injected into the Ukrainian, Moldovan and Georgian political system. When these kind of threats to democracy, they cannot be combated and constrained without functional security apparatuses, police, courts, intelligence services, prosecutors. And that is why it's absolutely imperative for the Eastern Partnership to start also trying to consolidate democracy and the transition and the functionality of the economies of the associated states, not only through a socio-economic means, but also through greater engagement, greater capacity building, and greater effort to try and consolidate the security sectors of the associated countries. Perhaps, and that is why some of you might have heard, and Katarina and Andrius and Mike, you've all heard me speaking about this idea that we have been promoting, but approximately a year ago with Pavlo Klimkin and Ekat Keshilashvili, we launched this idea for an Eastern Partnership Security Compact, where we call on the European Union to play up its game when it comes to strengthening and consolidating the security sectors of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, because fundamentally you cannot build functional democracies, functional economies without a functioning security sector that is much more immune both to corruption but also to external attempts to destabilize these countries.
Thank you so much, Nicu. And I see that Katarina just wanted to follow up on this regard, to reflect.
If I may very quickly.
Go ahead,
and I think that Nicu knows that there is a number of us very sympathetic to this notion of working with the security systems in broad sense. We certainly are engaged with the prosecutors' offices. We are engaged in judicial reform very, I would even say, too deeply. And that now we are in fact via NATO and funding for NATO engaged also in the security service. We have in Ukraine the EU that is very intensely working on the whole area of security sector reform. But I completely agree there is huge scope to build on it, and we are not there yet. But I think it's an important area. But one thing that has not been mentioned here, and I really want to take the opportunity to do it now, is to go back to the question you gave to Mike, Nino, and saying, you know, is it only to us, the civil society, to fight the oligarchic regimes? And the answer I would have is no, it's not only to the civil society. The civil society is extremely important, so is independent media, so are the fact checkers that sort through the disinformation. We have the security sector angle, but the one angle that has not been mentioned here is economic competition. And Ukraine is a fantastic example. Georgia was a fantastic example of when you open up sectors of the economy to competition, the corruption goes down immediately. Chatham House even did quantification that it's 6% of GDP in Ukraine every year that is saved by having closed the space to corruption. And I am not saying that there is not an undue influence of oligarchs in Ukraine now, but what I do say, and there are studies that show that as a class, they are much poorer than they were before, because they have to go and find room in sectors, and some of them have been really closed. There has been reform of procurement. One example for all is when Hrivna was let float, all the fabulous riches that were made by manipulating the fixed exchange rate disappeared overnight. In other words, there are ways of, in institutionally weak environments, which all post-communist countries are, including those that are already inside the EU, in institutionally weak environments, it's much more productive and effective to fight corruption before it occurs than try to punish it once it already happens. Because for that, you need the courts, you need the police troops, you need the prosecutors, you need the entire system that takes time to build. So, and this is country after country, one can see that the easiest way, or the safest and the quickest way, is to keep closing the space for corruption to occur. And you know, in Slovakia, getting a loan from a bank, you had to give a bribe. And then we restructured, privatized, have good corporate governance in the banking system, and that corruption simply disappeared. And I think that's why it's important to also look at the reform support from the angle of pushing for reforms that will close space for corrupt behavior. You know, you can take on licenses, you know, every little official was taking bribes for registering hypothecary rights. Well, you know, we increased the price and you could pay for having a quicker service, and suddenly there was no more corruption. So this was what Georgia has done very effectively. So I think this is really an important area to look at as well. And this is where we've been trying to reorient the EU assistance not to individual projects, but to systemic interventions, sector by sector, to try to reform the sector, but in a way that will make it harder for the oligarchic structures to feel at home in a specific area. So just wanted to
Thank you so much for your
bring that
reflection. And just to continue on this regard, you know that I am again bringing the example of my own country, not to offend my friends and Ukraine or Moldova, that for example, in Georgia, you mentioned truly that we were defeating the corruption, petty corruption very well, and still it's no such kind of big petty corruption in our country, but we're facing now the new reality, elite corruption in a very high level. And if you look the figures, I'm an economist, you know, and we love to say that only God we trust, all other bring a data. And since 2013, the Georgia's GDP per capita in US dollars is the same as it was in end of 2019, before pandemic. I'm bringing this data just to realize when it's something wrong. And you have this picture that for 8 years, not single a cent was increased, by single cent was increased the GDP per capita in the country. And you are investing a lot from US and from European side, you know. It's something wrong is going there. It should be some conditionality, or we're not discussing these issues because I don't know what should be the diplomatic way to explain to this to the different Georgian or Ukrainian or Moldovan government that they have to fulfill their exercise, homework. Mike or Andrius, you want to reflect? Mike, maybe you?
Well, yeah, thanks, Nino. I mean, I think that this issue of crony capitalism eventually leading down a path towards state capture is one that requires a variety of different remedies. I mean, once the state has been fully captured, it becomes very difficult to then implement these sort of market type reforms that will incentivize a reduction in corruption. Precisely, you can do what you've said was accomplished in Georgia, which is to reduce petty corruption, but still maintain large-scale elite corruption that fundamentally impacts the country's geopolitical trajectory. And so it's a very complex set of challenges that you have before you in each of these countries, because precisely there is widespread corruption, widespread crony capitalism that has sort of pervaded the entire system. And it just takes a lot of work, a lot of attention to reforms in different sectors. And it takes the international community's steadfast determination to press the governments. So, for example, you know, in Ukraine, we've recently been talking about corporate governance with regards to the Naftahaz Supervisory Board, which was suspended for a period of a couple days in order for the CEO of the company to be changed. Well, that's not just a blip on the radar screen. You can't just pass over that and pretend that that's just one little event that happened. That fundamentally impacts the entire system of corporate governance, because if you don't have trust that basic standards of corporate governance and transparency are being followed, that supervisory boards, for example, are truly independent and able to make decisions, then the system does not function as it was intended to. And you have at least the possibility that political interests can influence economic outcomes and use state-owned corporations or other corporations to their advantage. And so it really sort of behooves the international community, civil society, but also the business community to stay on each one of these cases and really make it, work together to ensure that standards are being followed and that this corruption doesn't result in this gradual corrosion of the institutions of rule of law.
Thank you so much, Mike. Andrius, if you want to reflect on that.
Well, I agree with Mike, and simply maybe I will add a few words in addition. Really, I remember, well, a very good statement was by Mike earlier, about two tectonic plates which are colliding, and that's what we need to face. That there are three major players, I would say. On one side, autocratic Russia, on another side, democratic EU, and in between of that, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And sometimes, we are trying to forget about this elephant in the room, what is really Moscow strategy or Kremlin strategy towards all that region. And it's very clear. I was speaking before, that this Kremlin strategy is very simple: not to allow those countries to reform themselves, to keep them in some kind of gray zone, And they're using all the hybrid or even military, methods to stop reforms in those countries, because, as I said, a reformed and successful Ukraine is the biggest danger to Kremlin regime. And here I think EU is for different reasons, but EU is still not using its soft power, huge soft power, which EU has in its capacity, in its hands, in order to, from one side, to assist Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova with their reforms, and in such a way to stop implementation of Putin strategy. And I think that one of the reasons why EU is not using its soft power, at least in such a way as EU is using soft power, for example, in Western Balkans, it's totally wrong, attitude towards, this elephant in the room, what I call, Moscow goals and Moscow targets. Unfortunately, in EU, still there is prevalence of, in some way, of a wrong attitude. Let's not provoke Putin. It's in such a way I see that in some big capitals or institutions there is an attitude towards more ambitious policy or assistance towards Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova integration. I think that if we should look more deep historical point of view, the best Russian people, the Russian society would be success of Ukraine, because that is really what moves the same direction. So that is where I see that we can, of course, we can give a lot of critical remarks about how Moldova are not making needed reforms, how they are backsliding with corruption, with erosion of democracy. That is true. We need also to see that there are any single example that any post-Soviet country, either from Central Europe or from former Soviet Union, including Baltic states, would be able to make needed reforms, to build their own success. If not, EU would use back in 1990s its soft power with all the force, giving those countries real integration and membership perspective. For time being, unfortunately, trio countries, who really were fighting for association agreement, who were fighting for visa-free agreement, and were doing quite a lot of different reforms and steps forward. For time being, they lack simply what is next in their way, in their what is next target, what they can achieve. since, as I said before, now still EU is not overcoming this, wrong perception that offering those countries more clear and more ambitious integration paths or even membership perspective, that will provoke Putin, and that is why EU is not able to speak an open language. I think that we need to find a way how to overcome this problem. If, for time being, EU is not able to speak full-scale language about membership, let's talk about some kind of intermediate status. What we are trying to speak about Romano Prodi formula, everything but institutions, just in order really to bring again very clear goals and targets to those countries in order to keep their motivation for reforms. If we shall continue as we did during last several years, motivation for reforms in those countries can really only diminish, and that will be the reason why those countries will backslide, and that will be the reason why Putin will be quite happy when he will see that oligarchs and all other backwards-looking influences will strengthen those countries.
Thank you, Andrius. You mentioned that the EU is not using their soft power on this regard. Katarina, what do you think? Why they're not using this soft power?
Well, it's much easier for Andrius from the European Parliament to expose weaknesses than somebody who works in the European Commission. So I would reflect on it the following way. We operate in a geopolitical context with which we operate, and it's not a surprise to anybody when I say that the European foreign policy is being shaped by a unanimity. In other words, every single member state having a veto power over decisions. And that's, there are books and articles written on this. And this is a defining parameter of how we operate. But that's on the pessimistic side. But on the optimistic side, actually, what has happened in 2012 and 13 and 14 and the development of the agreements and the signature, again, they were drafted and negotiated in a very different geopolitical situation. So they were written in an incredibly ambitious way. And the association agreements and the deep and comprehensive free trade areas, is a mouthful, in fact offer a much higher degree of integration than we currently have with any of the three countries. So what we have been concentrating on internally, and now that I'm also the head of the support group for Ukraine, this is something that I've been spending personally a lot of time on, is to really push the agenda and the integration in the sectors that's already foreseen in the agreements, rather than saying what next. Because the next is difficult, and I leave that to Andrius and others and Nicu to come up with important ideas. But I don't think that we should be doing it at the cost of saying, okay, what's next, without really exploiting what we have now. On the 19th of May, I have opened, together with Deputy Prime Minister Olga Stefanishina, a regular Green Deal dialogue between Ukraine and the EU, which in my view is extremely important to bring into one debate, and we'll have it every quarter, all the issues that Ukraine needs to do and where we can support and where we can bring others to support, all the elements that are going in the important green transformation this country needs to do. And it's going to be a very difficult one because of the structure of the economy and the legacy industries, etc. So that's just one example of a number of areas where we are trying to push the envelope and really use the full potential. I mean, it sounds like a slogan, but really use the agreements that we have on the table. Because if we just go for the next one, we risk actually not doing the homework both on the side of the EU and on the side of the associate countries to really reap the full benefits of them.
Thank you. And you mentioned the what next, and maybe Nicu, you're gonna to reflect on this regard. What do you think? What is next for these three like Eastern Partnership countries in a way to their Euro-Atlantic integration?
Well, that's a difficult moment to give a positive answer to this, but the answer to this will still, I think, come in the domestic capacity of the states to reform. These societies, we see, especially in Ukraine and Moldova, have recently expressed in the last couple of years a very strong desire to be governed differently. You have two new presidents whose arrival to power is basically based on the promise of fighting and defeating corruption. So on a popular level, we have a clear desire in these countries to be governed differently. And that's not the first time. So far, the failure has been more at the political elite level rather than at the popular level. And I have all the hope and confidence that this time, the leadership in these two countries will be able to push the cart forward, so to say. But also the international community can do a lot to help that. And here I'll make a kind of one macro point and one micro point. The macro point would be that we talk a lot about the need for a new burden sharing on European security between the United States and the European Union and now the UK. But very often that conversation is mostly focused on the 2% defense spending in NATO. But of course, the security of the Euro-Atlantic area is not only ensured through defense spending in NATO, but also through what the United States and most European states do in their own neighborhood. And here, I think it's very important when we talk about burden sharing is for the United States and Canada and Britain, who do much more when it comes to security engagement with a country like Ukraine or Georgia, to also make the case that a burden sharing means that most of the EU member states should play a bigger role in trying to anchor states like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia in the Euro-Atlantic community, not just of values, but when it comes to the functionality of institutions. And the second, a very kind of focused and zoomed in point is that if I look at especially Moldova, and here I will use the proviso that Katarina said in talking about her own country, I would only refer to Moldova and would not try to make a bigger point. But what we have seen in recent years in Moldova was the fact that on paper, there have been created very strong provisions protecting the justice system, the judiciary and the prosecutors. But this was done without strengthening the formal independence of these institutions, without fighting corruption. So what happened is that a super corrupt, rotten system was offered European levels of protection of their independence. So basically the best European standards of independence have been hijacked in the case of Moldova to protect a very corrupt system, which was used to perpetuate oligarchic rule, to perpetuate anti-democratic abuses. So that is a problem that I have, that is widely discussed in Moldova. And of course, the takeaway from the case of Moldova is that it's very good to apply the best standards of protection of the judiciary and the justice systems when it comes to independence. But it has to be done in parallel with a strong fight against corruption and a strong cleaning up of the system. Because if you don't do them simultaneously, these best international practices in the case of Moldova have been hijacked for purposes which basically weakened democracy and weakened the capacity of societies to reduce corruption. So that is a situation that we face in Moldova. Now, I know how tricky this is because a lot of other states make somewhat similarly sounding arguments for rather nefarious purposes in an attempt to centralize power. But nonetheless, that's something which happened in Moldova. So whenever we go down the route of conditionality and apply applying best practices is very important to get the whole package of best European practices and not selectively, because once this is done selectively, it might not solve the problem. It's a bit like antibiotics. If you do antibiotics, you have to take the full course, because if you only take it for 2-3 days, you end up strengthening the capacity of you know.
Thank
Yes, you understood my point.
I think that Katarina wants to
Just one comment. I would take this much beyond Moldova and much beyond the 3 countries we are talking about. And in fact, it's something that my friend Jana, who's standing there, heard me today say in 3 different occasions. It was well-meant and completely misguided advice. Right at the end of communism, you need to create independent judiciaries. Both the US and the EU are equally guilty of this, because what happened is that we created these nominally independent of other powers judiciaries without reforming them, without filling them with competent people who are not corrupt. And by definition, it's not a surprise that they then became protected professions, behaving like a medieval guild, protecting themselves. And we have this country by country, not only Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, we have it in Slovakia and Bulgaria and Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic, you name it. Because independence was misunderstood as lack of accountability. And that's what we have. And we are now trying to retrofit and trying to find ways how to help reform institutions who say, yeah, but I'm independent. And this is the dilemma that we are fighting and dealing with in this country, in the other 2 countries we discuss, in all of the Western Balkans, and in fact, in a number of the member states of the European Union. In my home country, it took, for this cleansing process to happen, it took a murder of a journalist and his fiancée 3 years ago to actually start a process that led to sort of putting the judiciary on different footing. So I think that we cannot reverse, we don't have a time machine to change that, but we need to understand that the very notion of independence, if it's mentioned without accountability, creates this vicious circle. And that's why we need to now go methodically into re-establishing an equilibrium where the judges are accountable to the notion of justice, as well as accountable within their profession and impartial in a judgment. But I think we should have been talking about impartiality and accountability. And I agree with Nicu that the notion of independence has actually been used to circumvent the very idea of it.
Thank you so much, Katarina. And we just 10 minutes left, and I don't want to leave the stage without asking all of you, about the Belarus. Because I think that yesterday I met my classmate from Belarus. She's a journalist, and she's hiding here in Ukraine. And all during the dinner time, all 2 hours, she was all the time when she was telling the stories, she were in tears, full of tears in her eyes, And Mike, I just want to address this question to you. Do you think that the West and the world is adequately answering to this, I don't know what to call to this man who is running this country? He's a dictator. He's I don't know, he was unprecedentedly piercing the flight from one European country to flight to another one. And is world is adequate responding on this kind of actions from dictators' side?
So, Nino, I think the short answer is no. We've seen a dictator who has gone far beyond any red lines that we would have set just a few weeks ago or a few months ago. not to mention a few years ago. The level of torture and repression is really off the charts. I mean, we're seeing essentially what is similar to a North Korean style regime being installed, being created in front of our eyes. And so the level of response has not been adequate yet, but I do sense that there is movement afoot. The EU Council has clearly stated that they have tasked the development of further sanctions, and I think the US will also match them and is looking at other ways to impose sanctions. I was very happy to see that the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced a $3 billion or maybe it's euro package in the event that there is a democratic transition in Belarus, to put something on the table that is positive as well. But the short answer to your question, is no, there's not enough is being done to change what is truly an appalling, disgusting level of repression. I mean, really, you have to go back to the deep, dark periods of the Soviet past to find something analogous. And it really should be met with a concerted, much more forceful response than we've seen to date.
Andrius, you want?
Yeah, I agree with Mike. Really, again, I can be self-critical that we in the West, we are not still not able to do what was needed to be done. Of course, the question is what can be done with such an dictatorial regime. So still, I think that democracies need to look, even looking into the future, what kind of instruments we need to have. Unfortunately, even some kind of international tribunals, according to regulations and traditions of today, are not able to be established so easily as we would like to see when we see some kind of those crimes which are committed by such a regime like Lukashenko. Second, I think that what we need to also to look that Lukashenko regime is surviving simply because he has the support of Mr. Putin. And that support really allows Lukashenko, both to be very brutal against his own people, and also to move into some kind of this, terrorist actions when he landed this civilian plane. I would say that really we need to raise very simple question: what price Mr. Putin needs to pay, if he is continuing to support such a regime in the center of Europe. And well, we hope that during the meeting of President Biden with President Putin, that question could be asked, and could be raised. That's our hope. And the last point, what I see a problem really is that if you look into some other stories, terrible stories and tragic stories which had happened, for example, on European continent earlier, during the last 30 years, like, all the atrocities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo story, or some other stories like, or Libyan, tragedies back in 2011. Always you could see that from the West side, here was somebody from the leadership, either, State Secretary Madam Albright with Kosovo story, or now I'm reading David Cameron memoirs. At least he is saying that he was very, very instrumental to start to resolve Libya tragedies. So, but in any case, all the time we could see that somebody was taking real personal leadership. I don't know who is from the West for time being is really could play similar role, or who is trying to play similar role. And that lack of leadership from the Western community side, I am not blaming only EU, I'm talking about the whole Western community. I think is one of the problems which we need to find a way how to resolve, because that is why from our side, there is not enough, it was not enough done to resolve this Belarusian crisis. We saw some sort of leadership, what Charles Michel have shown, in resolving much smaller political crisis of, Georgia, recent one. So I wrote him an open letter that, really congratulating him with that leadership, resolving Georgian crisis. And I said, you should show the same leadership in trying to be, to try to find the way how to resolve Belarusian crisis. But for time being, I see really this lack of the leadership as one of the problems.
If Katarina, Oksana, and Nicu wants to reflect on that, and we have to wrap up because only 3 minutes left. Nicu, you want some, like a 1 minute, very short? No? Okay. Oksana, you want to? Okay. Just very short, okay? Otherwise, we're in time.
In the Belarusian case, we realized that since 2010, destroying the opposition, even with the EU supporting Belarus and young people growing free and democratic, we still have the predicament that Belarus is in. One country is no longer able to cope with its challenges, and the security and success of Ukraine is a success and security for EU and America, and we can produce and scale democracy to Belarus, where human rights are so brutally violated.
Okay.
I think on Belarus also, because the downing of the plane happened just the day before the European Council, actually the reaction was very quick. The sanctions are under preparation. They are going to be much broader than it would have happened without. We have completely cancelled all the financing of the government. We have doubled our money for the civil society, for independent media, for psychological support for victims, etc. Most importantly, as Mike already mentioned, we have prepared a plan, very robust plan for a democratic Belarus. But going back to what Andrius said, frankly, I'm not sure whether this is going to be enough, since Mr. Lukashenko has the backstop. He has the backstop of the Kremlin, and unless that issue is addressed, I'm not sure whether ratcheting up sanctions and on the other hand supporting the freedom fighters is going to really be enough.
Thank you so much, Katarina. And just to wrap up, we have only 1 minute, and I have to express my sincere gratitude to all panelists. And listening to the panelists, I gathered the 4 main vital components to receive of the successful transformation of these countries. The number 1 is a high-level, meaningful and consolidated engagement from the US and the European side. And the second is the further consolidation of the civil society and free media, which is combination with the international support toward consolidating the democratic process. And in order to support the democratic developments in the front line, Western countries need to take decisive actions towards the regulating the oligarchs' money in the financial systems in Europe and the United States. The lack of political will in this regard has been resulted in the fact that many oligarchs have found ways to launder their money in the West. And last but not least, time to West to act to contain the Russia. Because what is going in Georgia and what is going in Ukraine right now, the creeping occupation of Georgia and the annexation of the Crimea and the Donbass war, a ceasefire there, is undermining the national security of these countries. And we have a short video since 2008, how many villages was taken by creeping occupation by Russian sides. It's already 200 villages. And if we're not going to stop Vladimir Putin right now in this region, then I'm pretty sure that world going to be very difficult, because one day they're going to knock some other a country's door as well. Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you, and I hope to see you all in person in Ukraine or in Georgia or in Moldova very soon. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.